What's up, nerds? Ukraine wants to launch a counteroffensive as early as 2024, but more than likely in early 2025. And I want to talk about this because this is an interesting thing to consider. There are also some comments by the Deputy General of Ukraine's military intelligence that may give us kind of a hint of what the next couple years in the war in Ukraine will look like. And I also want to talk about the likelihood of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, what it would try to accomplish, and why one may actually be very necessary for Ukraine. And I want to also talk about kind of some of the downsides of what a counteroffensive would be. Now, I'm recording all of this on the 6th of May, 2024. So let's get into this. Now, reports have circulated, of course, that Ukraine wants to launch a counteroffensive either towards the end of 2024 or sometime in 2025. The Russian offensive, of course, is starting right now. We've already talked about that in a video last week. I'm going to link you to that at the end of this video as well. But Ukraine is currently in a challenging spot. They're probably in the most difficult spot that they've been in since the start of the war, and hopefully, likely, one of the most difficult positions that they'll be in until the end of the war. We've already talked about the manpower and the ammunition shortages in other videos as well, so we're not going to get back into that. But that's kind of creating this condition for Ukraine right now where Russia has an incentive to launch its offensive right now, and it has a good chance on achieving some of its limited objectives, that is. However, Ukraine has an opportunity to kind of flip that on its head in the next several months. Now, by the end of 2024 and 2025, these issues will likely have already been addressed. Of course, the ammunition issue should be addressed within a couple months, not only with the passing of the U.S. aid package and the delivery of ammunition to Ukraine from the United States and from the European Union, but also with the manpower issue with the draft law being passed and those troops having graduated their training and been deployed to their units. For them to counterattack, they're going to first have to stabilize the front line. I mean, that kind of goes without saying. They're going to have to force the Russian offensive to culminate early, that is, to run out of steam before they actually achieve any of their objectives. But they're still going to have some manpower left over to exploit Russian exhaustion. Now, I want to take a step back for a moment to kind of share some important principles that are relevant to this whole situation. You can generally map the decisions made between two adversaries in a conflict as action, reaction, and counter-reaction. And this can basically go on in an indefinite cycle where, one side does one thing, the other side reacts to that thing, the first side reacts to how their adversary reacted, and they're kind of just in this reaction spiral, right? Reaction spiral, but you get what I mean. One example being the Russians launch an attack, that's an action. The reaction being Ukraine commits part of its reserve to stop the Russian attack, and then the counter reaction being Russia commits part of its reserve to continue the attack further. And that's just an example. Now further, and I mentioned reserves in this example because the use of reserves is incredibly important in this conversation. Both sides have them. They're a force behind the front line that's kind of like your 911, but they can also be used for larger kinds of operations. They can help you plug holes in your defenses in areas of weakness. So think of like your frontline forces being there to prevent a breakthrough and to kind of defend against just general attacks. But if there is a gap in defenses, then your reserve is the force that you would send to plug that gap. However, if say your enemy launches an attack, your frontline forces are able to successfully defend, and you assess that your enemy is weakened, you can use your reserves to exploit that weakness and to launch a counterattack and to try to gain some more territory for yourself. Now, you can likely guess by this point how I've described it that the condition of these reserves is incredibly important and incredibly sensitive. You don't want your enemy to be able to correctly assess the state of your reserves. Unless, of course, your reserves are in good standing. They're at full strength or above strength. They are very well equipped, and they're ready to go. The condition of the enemy reserves is going to basically tell you what you can and cannot do. Are your enemy reserves at full strength and in good condition? Then in that case, it's going to be pretty hard for you to launch a counterattack and achieve some kind of significant breakthrough until those reserve forces have been attrited. Now, are your enemy reserves below strength or in poor position? If that's the case, then now might be a great time for a counterattack. Now, of course, from this vantage point, we can't really assess the condition of either Russia or Ukraine's reserves. They're most likely closely held secrets, not only from each other, but from everybody else. But with that in mind, let's kind of discuss some comments made by the deputy chief of Ukraine's military intelligence, because that kind of gives us a hint on what the next couple of years in Ukraine will look like, and that quickly ties in to what this Ukrainian counteroffensive could actually look like and why they would be doing that. Quote, General Skibitsky says he does not see a way for Ukraine to win the war on the battlefield alone, even if it were able to push Russian forces back to the borders, an increasingly distant prospect. It wouldn't end the war. Another quote further down in the article says, such wars can only end with treaties, he says. Right now, both sides are jockeying for the most favorable position ahead of potential talks, but meaningful negotiations can only begin in the second half of 2025 at the earliest, he guesses. Now, the point of negotiations being at kind of towards the midpoint or the second half of 2025, I think is incredibly important, especially whenever we talk about the reports of a Ukrainian counteroffensive being late 2024, early 2025. That may tell us that Ukraine's goal is obviously to successfully defend against the Russian offensive, but then to react to that offensive with a counteroffensive. And their goal would be to take back as much territory as possible, likely what was taken during the Russian offensive. And their hope would be that the Russian counter-reaction would be to approach the negotiating table with Ukraine to negotiate into the war. Now, this, of course, is all a very big assumption based on just some comments from the Deputy General of the Ukrainian military intelligence and these reports of the counteroffensive and kind of mapping it out. So do take this with a grain of salt. But basically mapping this out on the calendar, we can see, okay, right now, basically the midpoint of 2024, it's crazy that we're already there. This year's flying by. But this midpoint of 2024 to the later point of 2024 is where Ukraine wants to defend the Russian offensive while preserving its own reserves and building up a separate force for a counteroffensive. Their goal, of course, in this point would also be to try to force Russia to commit some of its reserves so they can attrit those reserves in the future. Now, this can be done with forces being recruited and mobilized now, not only to beef up their own reserves, but also to, plug holes in the front line and build up a separate offensive force. They have new Western equipment coming in, not only from the United States, but from the European Union. But this all carries, of course, risks to their existing force that's been fighting for 2 years with no relief. And so the more people that they pull from their newly mobilized personnel that they send to the front line to kind of fill these gaps and to provide relief for the frontline forces, which desperately needs that relief, then the smaller the force they'll likely have to launch this counteroffensive, unless, of course, they're sending the new forces to the front line, provide some relief for those guys, sending the troops that have been on the front line for 2 years back to the rear to not only rest up and get some relief, but also those troops who are very well experienced by this point will be able to form that kind of force that will launch a counteroffensive. That might actually work as well. But of course, they have much less room to be able to play with this numerically than, like, say, Russia does, because we're talking about sheer population sizes here. Now, of course, by the time that this is done, let's say late 2024, early 2025, and the Russian offensive has culminated, then Ukraine will try to assess the state of the Russian military and the Russian reserves, and if they feel that the conditions are favorable for a counteroffensive, then they'll probably launch one. Now, this is not likely to push Russia all the way down to Crimea or to the Russian border, so I think we should kind of hedge our expectations. There were those expectations the last time Ukraine launched a counteroffensive, and it did not go very well at all. So let's just kind of understand that this isn't going to push Russia all the way out of Ukraine. I think that the goal right now would be to push the Russians back to the Surovikin line, and that might take several months or at least a few months to achieve. Then by that point, you're in mid to late 2025, and then that's whenever you can press Russia to negotiate. Now, I also want to mention that we still don't even know what the full extent of Russia's offensive is going to be. We're still in the earliest stages of Russia's offensive, and what Russia does in their offensive could easily throw a wrench in the Ukrainian plans and undermine their capability to actually launch a counteroffensive. But of course, Ukraine's goals right now are to basically achieve conditions that are most favorable to them by the time that negotiations with Russia pick up. It's still not going to be very favorable to them. Remember that Russia right now occupies just under 20% of Ukrainian territory. And so Ukraine would already be negotiating from a bit of a deficit, but at the same time, they can determine how far of a deficit they're negotiating from based, with a counteroffensive. Now, why would launching a counteroffensive be a bad idea if it is a bad idea? Well, of course, this takes us back to the reserve forces. The extent of the the Russian or Ukrainian successes in either offensive depends on the condition of their opponent's reserve force. Now, if Ukraine is, of course, able to preserve their own reserves while also forcing Russia to commit some of its own reserves during their offensive, then they might be in a more favorable position to launch a counteroffensive. However, on the flip side, if Russia's offensive achieves some successes and Ukraine has to tap into its own reserve force to defend, then that might put them in a bit more of a complicated position once it's time to launch a counteroffensive. Russia may be less likely now to commit some of its reserves in this offensive with the telegraphing of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2024-2025. Because now Russia needs to have a force on standby once their offensive culminates to be able to react to that kind of a thing. Now, this may on one hand prevent the Russian offensive from reaching its full potential at a time when Ukraine is likely at its weakest point in the entire war. But on the flip side, this may also prevent Ukraine from achieving the kinds of breakthroughs or successes in its counteroffensive that it might want to hope for. Basically, it's borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, or in this case, it's borrowing from the Ukrainian counteroffensive to stop the Russian offensive. So there's certainly a huge balancing act going on here. This is a year and a half we're talking about. That's a long time, especially in a high-intensity conflict like this, and anything can happen in that time. So this may be kind of what we're seeing out of Ukraine is their goal is to launch a counteroffensive with the goal of putting Russia back on the negotiating table with some level of Ukrainian leverage. But at the same time, none of this is going to end the war outright. The Ukrainian deputy general for their military intelligence basically laid it out. It seems like they're both basically fighting for a better negotiating position and not necessarily fighting for, the toppling of each other's regime. But at the same time, publicly, that's at least what Russia still wants. They still want to topple the Ukrainian regime. So Ukraine has to fight as if that is the case. Now, with all that being said, I want to hear your thoughts on this. It's an interesting topic, a little bit complicated, some assumptions being made here. So please do consider that. But I want to hear your thoughts, and I want to hear what you think might be coming up and whether or not a Ukrainian counteroffensive would be a good idea or what they could achieve. Like this video if it was informative, and subscribe for more analysis on the war in Ukraine as well as other conflicts as we go. With all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.